One.
Good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And today is Thursday, which means it's time for the Thursday Collective. I am joined with the Mrs. Amy Nacer.
Hello.
And Jack Schumann. Jacqueline are we in Colorado? Wherever we are, Hollywood. You're going to have to fill me in more later. I guess there's some news on the strike front, because it's a real question, is the Daily Wire going to pull that off? What kind of world are we living in when somebody like Ben Shapiro can, well, we're going to talk about that. Let's talk about what kind
don't get Mark started. He'll crash.
Well, yeah, it's great that you point that out, because our fourth panelist for the day, host regular, but on the road, and so holding a steering wheel, is Mark Pellegrino. Mark, how are you doing this afternoon? And is a rest stop nearby?
I keep looking for one, but the Pennsylvania Turnpike isn't turning one up yet.
All right. Well, I'll handle hosting the question. I know normally you would handle that, but we want to drive safe there. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say, even with your eyes on the road. Folks, today's topic, Daily Objective 690, is It's a Wonderful Rand. What? Well, of course, we all know that great holiday classic of altruism and self-sacrifice. It's a Wonderful Life. But what if, well, not what if George Bailey's life had been different, but what if our lives had been different? What if Ayn Rand had never come along, had never been born? That's a great question to ask about your own life. It's a great question to ask about the world. We're going to ask both. What would the world look like? What would our personal lives look like? Mark, are you ready to answer that question, or should I go with Jacqueline first?
You can go with Jacqueline first. I have some ideas, but I want to see what she has to say first.
Okay.
Well, I think so. When I was thinking of this topic, I thought about, where at what point, as Ayn Rand came into my life very early. I was around 21 or 22 years old, and it was actually after reading Ayn Rand that I had come back from living overseas in Europe. I went to Europe a Christian and came back an agnostic. And after reading Ayn Rand, I went full on atheist. And I think so. There are so many different points that where I could have made decisions that were based off of reading Atlas Shrugged, reading Ayn Rand's philosophy, that really took me in different turns in my life. So at many levels, I think if it weren't for Ayn Rand, I probably would have gone back to religion at some point, because I still didn't fundamentally have the necessary tools and philosophy to really be able to understand the inherent evil of religion. I was questioning, right? But you're taught not to question, and I felt guilt and shame for doing that. And I was going around in this rapid circle. I think that from a so I on the comedic side, I probably would have ended up at the January 6th insurrection with the way that my life was going. I would have been full on Tea Party, Trump supporter. Oh my God, the election was stolen. And I probably, so who knows? But then on the more kind of serious philosophical side, I was one of these people who, and I think a lot of people are like this. If I never learned about the two most fundamental philosophical phrases that I've ever learned about in my entire life, I would have never sought sort of the therapy route in order to fix it, which is the most fundamental, which is primacy of consciousness versus primacy of existence. And had I never understood that, because I had to. This is the other thing that I think a lot of, a bit of a tangent here, but that I think a lot of people come to read Ayn Rand, and then they get to her fiction first, and then they read her nonfiction. And what a lot of people don't get, which I certainly didn't get, it took me decades to get it, was you can't just put on the philosophy like it's a coat, on top of what you've already got. You've got to tear yourself apart in a way. You've got to figure out where you're at first. Like you look at the philosophy, like this is where I want to be, but I need to understand where I actually am first. And, kind of take yourself down so you can build yourself up. But I never would have gotten that. And now it's like I can divide people into two groups. These are like the fundamental groups of people. If you're operating on a primacy of consciousness, I'll talk to you, obviously, but I need to, understand where a person is at so that I can sort of meet them at that level if I decide I want to have a conversation with them. But I'll stop. There's more I can say, but let me kick it off to one of you guys.
Well, we can always come back around again, but that's a great point. When I hear the expression POC, and then I'm told nowadays that means people of color, it's kind of like anybody who uses that phrase, I'm kind of dealing with a primacy of consciousness psychology anyway. So it's kind of right that comes up. And it's interesting that you went right to atheism and religion, because I kind of glossed over that in thinking about this myself. I want to stick with ladies first and go to Amy, but first I got to give a shout out to one of the ladies with the super chat, Mary Aline. Thank you very much for that. It's the season of giving. What do you mean Christmas is over? No, it's always the season of giving. We need your support. Ayn Rand Center UK, the channel that hosts this, all of the daily objectives, all of the other programming, all of the study groups. We need your support. Membership link is at the top. If you're not already a member of the ARC UK, click that link. Click become a member for £9.99. No, not 999. £9.99 a month. You can be a member of the ARC UK, but also any super chats you put in, like Mary Aline did. Thank you again. We'll support the ARC UK, and thank you for that. Now, Amy, in regard to this question, do you have an idea of how the world would be different or how your personal life would be different?
Well, I can just say a little tiny bit about how I think the world would be different. I think that America would be in much worse shape in terms of much more lack of freedom than we have now. Definitely. And I think that also to your point, Jax, about psychology, I think psychology would be in a terrible state. And I think that Ayn Rand really has influenced the field of psychology in very, very good ways. But yeah, going back to the primacy of consciousness versus primacy of existence, that was a big one for me. And I still refer back to that. It is a really interesting thing to do when you meet somebody and you think, which camp are they in? Are they more fact-based? Are they more grounded in reality? Are they looking towards, to Jesus or to Buddha or to astrology or to whatever it is? For me, so that's the first question. For me, I actually wrote out basically like a full page thing on this, which I won't read word for word, but it was a very interesting exercise. And I think every objectivist should do that. Think about where you used to be before you found Ayn Rand and ask yourself what your ideas were. Even, of course, a lot of people are going to be having more implicit ideas. For me, I had a lot of explicit ideas when I was a teenager. I was an avowed Nietzschean existentialist. And so I found Nietzsche, I found existentialism, I read other existentialists. And it was, but I also read a lot of during the French Revolution, you had Voltaire, and thankfully I discovered him before I discovered Rousseau. So I already had a pretty good grounding in terms of understanding free will, rejecting determinism, but I would have had a hell of a time finding a positive view of life, a benevolent view of life. It would not have, if I had any glimmer of it in childhood, it would have been gone by my 20s. It would have been, cynicism and subjectivism. And I had a real fire when I was younger about, I thought about, before Ayn Rand, I thought about moving to New York, becoming some kind of performance artist or something. But basically giving every kind of emotional articulation to my view of life at the time, which was subjectivism and cynicism and emotionalism and Nietzscheanism. when I was a teenager, I was just as an example, I was thrilled when I could use sarcasm to prove a point about hypocrisy, or to illustrate a contradiction. And I would love to get a rise out of people, the people whose ideas I was against. And I would just get a real zing out of when when they couldn't respond in an intellectual way.
Of course, I know people who, after objectivism, are still all about sarcasm and zingers.
It's true.
And there is a place for that.
Yeah, so it was validating, and it gave me more motivation to see other people as malevolent. And it was rewarding for me at the time to translate this view into art. I was, really into punk rock and goth, and some of them were better forms of it. But yeah, I would have had a really hard time with pragmatism and understanding what principles were. Sure, I could pick apart things, and say, you're a hypocrite, or find contradictions, but, I would have no positive assertions. I would not have been able to say, these are my positive assertions. This is my values-oriented philosophy. I would have none of that. And it would have been very sad. I probably would not have found love. I probably would have not gotten married. And I would basically have probably burnt out in my 30s or 40s.
Tough childhood.
Well, that would have been a freaking tough adulthood.
Right. But
Thankfully.
I mean, you had the kind of tough childhood that would have led to a difficult adulthood.
Yeah.
Without philosophy.
It's true.
Mark, were you trying to say something earlier? Is Mark frozen?
Could you hear me?
Wait. Now I can hear you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We did not hear you earlier, but we can hear you now.
Oh, good. So I was just curious what a Nietzschean existentialist was. Was it somebody who was really mean but thought it was absurd to be mean, or what is that?
No, it wasn't so much about absurdism. At the time, it was about selfishness, but in an emotionalistic and subjective way. It was not based on reason. So that's one of the big differences between Nietzsche and Ayn Rand, is that she grounded selfishness in the nature of man, our type of consciousness, and reason, and using reason. But yeah, there was none of that in Nietzsche. So it was really all about kind of, and I mean, in terms of like a values, in a sense of values, it was sort of like, take what you want. And if things go wrong, or if you hurt people, or if you hurt yourself, then that's just an experience you have. And that experience doesn't have any value implication. That's not to be judged. Everything is subjective. It's just getting what you want and how you feel at the time. So that's what that was.
As much emotionalism as existentialism.
Yeah.
So, Mark, what about you? What would be different in your life had Ayn Rand not become involved in it?
I'm a lot less optimistic than Amy about the influence of objectivism in the political sphere and in our world in general. I tend to think that without Rand, the world would look pretty much the same. I think the people in Washington who claim to have read Rand or like Rand have no real grasp of what she means and have not used it as a tool to progress liberty. So I don't know that it's held off the advance of collectivism so much. So I really think that the world would sort of be teetering on the edge of disaster as it is now. I know that my ability to deal with that fact would be much less potent. And I'm not even saying as a potent voice for other people in the world to help them deal with, the chronic psychological problems and existential angst that people have now. I'm talking about even my own capacity to deal with what's in front of me and the nihilism and destructiveness that's out there. And Rand gave me the tools and the language to be able to not only combat those negative forces, but to build something strong within myself that enables me to see myself as a value, and to act for my own good, which it's not a self-evident thing for people to do that. I think most people feel a hell of a lot of guilt when acting for their own interests. They feel guilty, feeling pride and a sense of accomplishment over what they do. And the culture promotes that. It endorses that kind of humility, which I think is very unhealthy psychologically. And I'd probably be buying into all that kind of sick stuff. I would have no antidote for it. I'd be poisoned all the way to my soul. And now I'm able to protect and preserve my soul, and hopefully pass on enough of the language and formulas that we know to help other people do the same.
No, that's a really good point. And it was something also that, Amy, you brought up about the malevolent universe versus a benevolent universe. That was another, really big thing, for a shocker for me, because I probably would have erred more on the side of nihilism and just negative about the way that the world is going. It's really, but then you have to kind of take a step back and look at it, what a relatively safe world we live in. At least this country, right? A relatively safe country that we live in. There's definitely pockets of, bad areas, but that and the crime rate lowering and lifespan extending, that wouldn't happen if it weren't for this, and I excuse my word for saying, collective benevolent universe attitude that most people have. But I wouldn't have been able to put it in those terms. What, Mark?
I think most people have that benevolent universe outlook.
I don't think it would be possible to have the world, the country that we live in today, without a majority of people having a benevolent universe, even if they and I say this even in spite of what they say, because I just don't think it would be possible to have this kind of world if most people, a majority at least, didn't have a positive outlook. We're looking at, we talk about environmentalists and the world is going down the tubes, and we're looking at, and we're watching news, and we're looking at what all the media is saying, but we're not going to, we're not out in the wild, right? We're not like going to different states where most people are like, hey, everything, like, it's all good. I think that the media is obviously biased on both sides, and they want us to believe the worst of things. But if it's that bad, I feel like we'd be living in a bigger dystopia than we think we may be entering.
Now that's interesting, because I agree with you both. And I've got to say that, but first I've got to say huge shout out to Mary Aline in with the super chat again. Mary Aline made the point earlier, you have to start where you are. This is great advice for anybody who's relatively new to these ideas. Anybody who's tuning in who said, I don't know that much about Ayn Rand, or I'm not an objectivist. She says, you have to start where you are. She says, this was hard for me to understand. If you don't, objectivism will be a floating abstraction for you. And Catherine is also in with the super chat. Thank you for that. She says, I was a lefty. Rand/objectivism shook my world, made it make sense. Trying to learn, internalize, and live her philosophy. And that's interesting. We assume a lot of folks come from the right, but no. In my case, I know as many, maybe more people who came from the left into these ideas. I love the point that Ayn Rand makes in the opening lecture for the New Intellectual, that a lot of the new objectivists are coming from the left. They may be more irrational, but they're still focused on asking questions. They're not mired in conservatism. I don't know how much that's still true in the world of DIE and CRT and woke and all of that. but at least some of them are still looking. Some of them are still looking for answers. And one more super chat from the amazing guitarist, Richard Cameron, who says, I suffer from severe hypermania. Without the guardrails of objectivist axioms, I would have slipped into psychosis. Well, I certainly understand the idea of objectivism giving you that kind of structure. And if I could...
That's something that's really interesting to me, actually, because hypermania is, correct me if I'm wrong, is a kind of a delusional state of a loss of reality, or like a detachment from reality. So I think that's really, really interesting. And I commend Richard for keeping that in check and dealing with that. That is not something that's easy to handle.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because there have been objectivists who have made the claim, well, the whole field of psychology could be subsumed under objectivism. And as foolish as that sounds, I kind of get it, because I have seen philosophy cure psychological problems. Well, they weren't really psychological problems. They were philosophical problems that manifested themselves psychologically. So although I don't agree, and I think psychology is a hugely important field, and many of their solutions, philosophy ain't going to fix it. But I totally get that philosophy can address those of us who've had philosophic challenges that led to psychological states. I totally get that. I have to agree with Mark that the world is nowhere near, not even a shadow of what it should be. And philosophically, the country, you know, it was interesting. There was an article in Politico, 7 politicians who praised Ayn Rand, and they give the usual list of, you know, Paul Ryan and Rand Paul, and even Ronald Reagan. Somewhere I've got a letter of Ronald Reagan saying, yeah, I admire Ayn Rand, to a friend who had suggested one of her articles. And Clarence Thomas and Gary Johnson and Mark Sanford. And none of these people are objectivists. Some of them, you would argue, are the opposite of an objectivist. But I do think that Ayn Rand had that impact. I think she gave capitalism so much support that even the people who don't get it at least could feel somewhat confident that capitalism was not just arbitrary, it was not just conservatism. And some of the great capitalists out there, some of the great businessmen out there, some of them have been objectivists. I don't think the world is anywhere near politically where it should be. It's not objectivist at all, but I do believe, and I agree with Jax, it would be much worse without her. I really believe that Ayn Rand has saved the world many times over, even though, again, where we're at right now is a shadow of where we should be. And I look at countries, you don't even have to go as far as North Korea or post-Soviet Russia, but countries like Venezuela, countries where without capitalism having some degree of credibility, and Ayn Rand, you know, would Milton Friedman have had the kind of cachet that he did without people like Ayn Rand also being on the scene? I don't think so. I believe she has already saved the world several times over. And on the personal level, I believe that every life lived, every life touched by Ayn Rand's ideas, including the thousands, hundreds of thousands of objectivists out there, but also the people who studied Ayn Rand never became objectivists, but had a little more self-confidence, a little more ambition, a little more respect for reason and logic. Every life that was made better by Ayn Rand has made the world better. You know, when it comes down to judging the state of the world, to me, that's what counts most, is the individuals and ultimately the culture, and ultimately that affects the politics and has probably saved our lives, but especially just the bulk of individuals who have been touched by these ideas.
And individuals who in turn become influencers, right?
To some degree, to some small degree.
Look at like Mark. Mark has like over 500,000 Twitter base, and with his reality checks. Look at the ARI, what they're doing. Look at what Iran is doing. I mean, it's a dent. It's a dent, and I'll take a dent over no dent any day of the week.
Well, let me just make, because you're right, let me make the point that dent is world saving. And the reason is our enemies, our opposition out there on the left, and the crazies on the right who stand in the way of fighting the left, they would have so much more, I was going to say self-confidence, even though it's hard to imagine that word applying to them. If they did not know that there was credible opposition, no matter how small, if they did not know that we were there to make a dent, that we were there to show that the emperor has no clothes. If they had more self-confidence, just one obvious example is Bernie Sanders would have won the last election instead of Joe Biden. My proof that the world isn't quite as bad. It's not end of the world.
Yeah, but how much? I'm sorry. How much of that is, the semi-animated corpse of the American sense of life?
Well,
which I think Rand has contributed to it in a way, but it's also something that was alive for a couple of
I agree
years.
with you that that's the core, but I think that core, it wouldn't be a core, it would be a corpse without Ayn Rand. That's what I would say.
Well, I feel like I'm the voice of pessimism here. I apologize, because I like Robert Naby's point of view much better than mine.
Well, in a way, I agree with you. It's hard for me to sound optimistic, which I do, and then have to remind people that the world we live in is a pale shadow of what it should have been. We did a talk called "Where's My Flying Car?" There's a book with that title too. And the point is, where the hell is the world we should have seen by 2023?
Yeah, so, the world that H.G. Wells and Jules Verne saw when they were in the midst of watching the Industrial Revolution transform human life before this counter revolution came over and metastasized to what it is today.
Well, didn't you hear President Biden the other night in the State of the Union, where 10 years from now we're not going to need oil at all?
Yeah. The irony is that in an objectivist world, he would be right. We'd still use oil anyway.
But in his world, we're not going to. In his world, we're not going to need it because we'll be back in the horse and buggy.
Exactly.
And we'll be walking.
There is something else I wanted to touch on in terms of philosophy, and I know we've got a bunch of other super chats too. So I'll turn it over to Robert after that. But I think when we talk about the effect that Ayn Rand had and her philosophy had on psychology, I think, look at people now like Gina Gorlin, who's making like leaps and bounds in the field of psychology, in my opinion. But way back in like the 60s, I think maybe 60s, 70s, this new type of therapy came out called cognitive behavioral therapy. And that has been revolutionary in terms of when you look at, the kind of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, but CBT is based on reality. It is all based on what you think translates into how you feel. And that's, I think that there is a heavy influence from Rand on that. She's the only philosopher who actually, completely conjoins with that type of therapy, because in CBT, you've got these 8 cognitive distortions, and it's all based on what is the real reality and what is it that you're bringing to the table that's distorting it. So I think that has been revolutionary.
But do you know that that's true? But do you know it for sure? Do you know Rand's influence, that she had an actual influence on that school of psych? Because it's the only school, in my view, that's actually very helpful to people.
I think it's compatible. I'm going to do some research and find out.
It's compatible, but what's her influence? Her actual influence? We're speculating now, and that would be truly revolutionary, because I think psychology is in a dark age. And I've been on the couch since I was 16. That should say something. That cognitive behavioral therapy, you're in and out in a year. Maybe whatever time it takes for you to resolve and work through these problems consciously, so that you're no longer under their thumb but controlling them.
The most I would say, because I don't know the answer to Mark's question whether there was a direct link there, but there were therapies, effective therapies, before Ayn Rand. All I can say is, because of Ayn Rand's influence, I think more of us have been willing not just to try those therapies or adopt those therapies, but to champion them. And the best example I can think of in that regard is Maria Montessori in education. Well, she certainly predated Ayn Rand, but the influence of Ayn Rand on Montessori, and in practice, that we got whole schools of Montessori across the country being started by objectivists. And even before then, Ayn Rand's effect on, again, people's acceptance of, let's use logic and reason in regard to these challenges. Catherine Dickerson was on the show with James Valiant and I last week. If you didn't see that episode, that was, if I can say, really outstanding. And she's talking about PET, or parent effectiveness training. And those were approaches that came around before Ayn Rand was speaking out publicly on psychology. So I agree with you, Jax. I don't know if it was a direct connection or not, but I will say that Ayn Rand has made these technologies, these psychology and communications approaches.
I would say something, I don't know for sure, and a lot of this, again, we're talking anecdotal experiences here, but I don't think that altruism would have been rooted out so quickly in psychology as it had without Ayn Rand, and obviously through Nathaniel Branden and his work at the time. I don't think that the idea of self-love or taking good care of yourself, or taking care of yourself before you take care of others or your children, would be an acceptable viewpoint without Ayn Rand. And you'll see that. I mean, you just pick up any silly magazine out there, and some self-help guru is going to talk about self-love and taking care of yourself, and it is very much on the side of, or going away from altruism in a practical sense. And I don't think people would really, I think a lot of people have been primed for that, rejecting altruism and then discovering Ayn Rand and saying, okay, this is a rational definition of what selfishness is. And that falls in line with my thinking, because I've heard this before.
Well, I hope you're right about that, because I do think there's a battle coming between the effective altruists, if I can use that oxymoron, and objectivism. And yes. I am really looking forward to when we make a dent in that school.
Yes.
Oh man.
Yes.
I want to hear Yaron Brook or Onkar Ghate talk to William McCaskill, whose book, incidentally, I will be discussing later today, What We Owe the Future. Effective altruism wasn't enough for this guy. Now he thinks that we need to be altruists in regard to the potential billions or trillions of people in the future. So in that regard, I don't doubt that objectivism has had some cultural impact, but
yeah,
man, we got a long way to go.
Right.
Yes.
So we have some.
Well, the good news is.
Yeah, let me get into those super chats real quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go
No,
ahead,
Mark, what were you going to say? The good news is.
Yeah, the good news is one rational person is worth 2,000 or 3,000 irrational ones, maybe even 2 or 3 million. So when the message gets out, when one rational person faces off against the horde, it's usually so clear. Makes everything so clear, and objectivists do it better than anyone else. I can't wait to see that battle between the effective altruist and a really sturdy objectivist, because it'll be an interesting fight.
I remember Leonard Peikoff made an offhand comment talking about the future, and he said, well, there is the fact that we're right, and reality counts for something. And I remember laughing at the time, because it's true, and it's an understatement, but it also reminds you that that's not necessarily enough. Now, James Valiant in the chat with a generous $10 super chat as well says, despite coming to Rand as both an atheist and sympathetic to the free market, well, I'm certain I would be a confused and unhappy pragmatist. Oh man, how many of us?
I can see that, especially from the lawyer's perspective.
Well, that too, for sure. Excellent. Catherine is in again with $4.99 and says, Rand totally made me do a 180 on capitalism and appreciating industry, inventors, the doers. Yes. Well, thank you for that, Catherine. Yes. I could not agree more.
Yes.
Way to go, Catherine. I've been watching Catherine's progress. Very good.
Outstanding. Mary Aline is in again and says, objectivism gives me hope, keeps cynicism at bay, which love that. And I am all in favor of it. If anybody out there should be the optimists, it should be those of us who have the instruction manual to life. And finally, Ashley Shrugged with $1.99 says, objectivism has helped my severe depression immensely. Well, that is good to hear. Good news. And again, I never discount therapy if that is something that you need. Severe depression sounds serious. But yes, just straightening out some of the philosophical challenges that we had growing up. I didn't talk much
I
about
think therapy should be looked at more as like personal training. None of us balks at having a personal trainer to get our physical bodies in condition. I think that we could all use, I mean, we deserve it. I think I don't think that, I really wish that the shame of going to therapy were not so, because I've been in therapy for over 10 years. And while I don't, have traumas and stuff all the time, I went as a result of severe PTSD, but I still go back. And it's always great to get a mental check and, like kind of help, get you, pull your head out of wherever it is. And
such a great comparison. Oh my gosh. I mean, we know people who say, well, my psychology is not that bad. But I also know people who say, well, my physiology, I mean, my arms are great, but my pecs could use a little, let me go to the trainer. So we will do tweaks in terms of our body that we should be willing to do in our psychology. Absolutely.
I'll tell you what, in acting class, unfortunately, people are pushed into the realm of emotionalism and to fear becoming aware of what makes them feel what they feel. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, I was with a group of actors, one of whom was fairly famous woman at the time, and she was very neurotic, and I was talking about how I went to therapy, and how enlightening and how good it was for me to talk about things that I didn't have perspective on before. And she said she couldn't do it. I recommended that she go. She said, no. I don't think she thought she was going to lose her acting talent because people, even like my mentor, Sandy Meisner, thought your talent resided in your neurosis. And I tried to tell her even then, this is around the time I was getting Rand. I'm like, no, neurosis is a distance from reality. It's an inability to respond appropriately to what's real. You're either hyper sensitive to something or undersensitized. You're not in reality, and exposing yourself to what's really going on, really being introspective and working through that stuff, your emotions will become more powerful, more rooted to reality. It's better for you. It's a spiritual steroid. Take it. So I never felt shame about going to a doctor to figure out what the fuck was wrong with me, and no more than I would going to a doctor to figure out what's wrong with my heart or what's wrong with why can't I move my leg this way. I always figured it was about life and trying to live your life in the best way possible.
Yep.
I think that advice is worth its weight in gold right there. I meet a lot of objectivists who say, I already believed all this stuff. Ayn Rand didn't really change my life at all. She just gave me different words, better words, clarified a few things. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of that because I was absolutely not that kind of person. I mean, I was already value oriented. I was already an atheist, but I wouldn't say that I was certain of any of that.
Those are the people, in my opinion, who don't really have a full grasp on the leaps and bounds of her philosophy. I can't remember, Mark and I and Jennifer were doing a podcast. I think Rucka was on it as well. And it was the famous Daily Wire rant where many shorts were made of Mark going off, threatening to do all kinds of damage. But it was a very heated debate and discussion, and then we had a lot of comments in the YouTube, not the chat, but just in the YouTube. And some of the comments came in. They were like, "Oh God, you guys get a grip, and why don't you just do something original? You're doing a remake of Atlas Shrugged. Do something original. Stop being a second-hander." And
Who said that? Who said it? Give me their address. I'll show up at their doorstep and let's see if they say it to my face. Wait, before you go on.
It was interesting. Okay, go ahead.
I know
Mark.
you have more of a story, but I have to say your version of that story was original. That's what pisses me off.
I know. So this person, I will say to this person's credit, because I ended up kind of going back and forth with them, like, do you know what it is to be original? You can tell a story that's been told over and over again, but if you do it in a creative way, and that is original. But they were comparing, and this person was a long time Rand person, Rand follower, right? But they were calling what we were doing as secondhanded. I'm like, do you know what it is to be secondhanded? The second-hander is primacy of consciousness. That's not what we're doing. Look up, look up what second-handed means. That means you're getting validation from other people. You're relying on other people for your own validation. To this person's credit, they actually came back and said, "Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to look into that more." Thank you.
When a band covers a tune, and they cover it and they make it completely unique, even though the band they're covering may have done it in a way that you thought couldn't be covered in any other way. This band does it and they put their own signature on it. It's completely original, even though the song is redone. Look, you took a story that we've read before, many of us a number of times, and you made it original. It's like Guns N' Roses doing Live and Let Die, right? Yeah. Or something like that. It's their own
Houston, what Whitney Houston did with "I Will Always Love You," which was a Dolly Parton song.
Hello. Yes.
But yeah, I didn't mean to detract to go on to. I'm just to Robert's point about many objectivists who claim Ayn Rand she just gave me the words that I already knew, and I would resubmit or argue that they really don't have. It took me freaking 30 years to understand many of her like her epistemology. Took me forever to I studied that book for years and years. Yes. And I have notes in the margins, and there's still parts where it blows my mind, and I'm like, I don't think I've gotten that yet.
I remember last week when we asked the question, what would you ask Ayn Rand? And you said, how did you come up with this?
With measurement omission. Yeah, like what the hell?
Yeah. And she didn't she say at the time it just flowed out of her pen?
Because she was already doing it, because she introspected. So she knew. How many of us introspect to a degree where we know what we're doing when we form a concept? Now before we wrap, just to give the answer to the personal side of this, I have to give an Ayn Rand quote, because she said in Philosophy Who Needs It, she said, "You have no choice about the need to hold some philosophical principles. Quote, your only choice is whether your principles are true or false, whether they represent your conscious, rational convictions, or a grab bag of notions snatched at random, whose sources, validity, context, and consequences you do not know. Notions which more often than not you would drop like a hot potato if you knew," unquote. Now, I was doing at 20, maybe 25, age 25, I was doing better than random, but I did believe at the time that philosophy was a matter of just accumulating wisdom from life and from art and from a variety of different philosophers. The idea that one philosopher was right, that a single philosopher had successfully answered most of the important questions in life, and that I didn't, need to assemble Nasserism out of little bits and pieces of everything. That was a kick in the head that I would not have, there wouldn't have been an opportunity to achieve that kind of state, the idea of a unified, integrated philosophy where each part is consistent with the rest of it. That's, I could talk about my ambitions and my career. It changed everything. But just that idea that, oh my gosh, somebody actually got it right. And yes, to the idea that passion is emotionalism or originality is random, that's a hard one for people coming into objectivism, to make that point to them that no, embracing reason and logic is not going to make you flat. It's going to make you more passionate, because you'll know you're right. You'll know your values matter. You'll know that self-assertion is the correct posture. It will make you more passionate. Just like realizing that originality isn't random, that creativity isn't just, throwing crap out there. I know we have the sense of throw something at the wall, but that we can actually attach these ideas that come up from our self-conscious to things. So yes, objectivists should not only own reason and logic, we should own passion. We should own originality and creativity.
Amen.
Yeah. So Robert, where would you be today, though, if it weren't for Ayn Rand?
I might still be running a fast food restaurant. Shortly after embracing objectivism, that I made the shift from being a restaurant manager in fast food, a Hardee's restaurant, to getting into electronics and then IT and establishing myself with the information technology field. I may well still have been, trying to get by, running restaurants, having a pretty good time, but not as good as it could have been, not as good, kind of like we were talking about the world, not as good as it could have been, not as good as it should have been. And without that self-confidence, that certainty that, oh my gosh, I actually know things. I actually have moral principles that I've validated, and not just, oh, that's me. That's what I'm like. And you put your name on something as if that by itself is a certain matter of pride, but without any grounding, without any validation other than, well, Amy mentioned pragmatism. It works well for me. Turns out we can do better than that.
That's a good point. I will say that if it weren't for Rand, and her inspiration of doing the thing that you love to do, I most likely would not have. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I most likely would not be a writer today, because I was listening too much to other people. It's too hard to break into it. You're not going to make any money at it. You're not that good at it, and so I would have listened to other people and not, kind of given them the virtual F off and just gone off and like, okay, I'm not good, I'll get better. There you go. So
excellent. Well, we do have another super chat in from Katrine Kohler. Looks like a member of Mark's well-earned fan club. She says, I learned about objectivism and Ayn Rand because of you, Mark. Not at least because of that. I found the motivation to get out of a toxic workplace I was at and am now at a much better job.
Way to go, Kate. You're awesome.
Outstanding. Well, I think we can all agree that objectivism has had a profound impact on our personal lives. I know that there was a meeting point in the middle, sort of, as far as the impact that she has had on the world. Again, I still believe the world is, what did I say, a pale shadow of what it should have been. I want that flying car. More than that, I want the kind of prosperity that we all should be enjoying right now. So yes, the world has been destroyed. But not yet, not completely. In some ways, we are still surrounded by miracles, not least of which is ourselves. So I do believe Ayn Rand has saved the world several times over, even though objectivism is far, far, far from having won the day. Personal opinion.
Even if she hasn't, I tend to agree with you, Robert. Even if she hasn't, she is the solution for the future. She will get us out of this insanity if people start embracing reason, rational self-interest, more reality-centered world and take on the world that we need to progress and move forward.
I think it'd be an interesting story to create the apocalypse. Everything is gone, and then somebody finds a copy of Atlas Shrugged and start over from scratch.
It might be more believable than somebody finds an electric guitar. A la 2112.
Yeah.
Well, if there is a mission, then to save the world, Ayn Rand, of course, has already done that, but now it's up to us. And we better get to it. On the Ayn Rand Center UK, the next show up, I believe, is mine. I'll be talking about what we really owe the future. Again, I've been meaning to talk about the book, William McCaskill's latest, What We Owe the Future. This is the villain behind effective altruism. I know Peter Singer is the philosopher behind it. McCaskill is a philosopher, and he is au courant. He is the man making it happen. So I want to talk about that, and I'm going to, if you folks want to join me for that in 4 hours. But this has been an outstanding discussion. I think we've agreed on just about everything, including the impact of Ayn Rand on our personal lives. Huge thanks to those of you who put in super chats sharing your thoughts, and there were also in the chat some of your personal stories as well. Any sign-off thoughts before we go? Jacqueline, Mark, Amy?
I thank my lucky stars that I found Ayn Rand. Thank my lucky stars. It's, it's, I may have been dead, like, by the time I was my age now.
Your case was pretty extreme.
It was pretty extreme.
Pretty extreme
I
impact.
went to my childhood and all that stuff, but, yeah, you, Mark, you started on the couch at 16. I started at 15. Yeah.
Wow. Well, yes, I think in the end, Rand has saved my life. She's given me the tools to navigate a world that I didn't know that I could before. And hey, man, when you save one human being, you save the world. So there you go.
I'm just thanking everybody in the chat. So I will say I wouldn't have found this cool community of people that I get to hang out with, that I get to have rational conversations with. I wouldn't have found my writing partner, Jennifer. I wouldn't have met all of you great people at ARC UK, and I wouldn't have met Tal and Yaron, and it's a great quote unquote tribe. I know we're not tribalists here, but you know, I wouldn't have met Mark, my big brother. So, but yeah, I love this community.
Outstanding. With that said, Ayn Rand has massive impact for all of y'all out there. I know she's doing that for y'all already. Get out there, get some more, make it happen. Good day, all.
Peace.
All right, guys, take care.